The Lexington Hotel in Chicago held warm light and polished silver, while the street outside held cold air and a city trained to keep its lines. Before lunch was finished, a quiet boundary in American crime shifted. Rebels stopped pushing into a neighborhood they had been bleeding for. Money began moving, as if a war had been canceled without an announcement. A man who could order violence instead chose a ledger. A man who was supposed to stay invisible was invited into the fortress. Al Capone did not call it mercy. He called it business, and he let Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, leave with something no one was meant to see. So what was promised in that room that made one young Harlem operator effectively untouchable? November 17, 1928, Chicago. A private dining room in the Lexington Hotel. The table was set like a celebration. Crystal, wine, food arranged to look generous. Outside that door was a city that solved problems with guns and alleys. Inside that room was a problem violence could not correct. Al Capone waited, not in a lobby, not in public, in his headquarters, his fortress, a place where strangers did not arrive by mistake. And then a stranger arrived anyway. A black man walked through Capone's hotel and did not get turned away. He did not get laughed out. He did not get beaten for the attempt. He was escorted upstairs. He was searched. He was watched, and he was still admitted. This was not an accident. This was not anger. Capone had been told to expect him. That alone was a violation. In that era, it was a violation of the street. And it was a violation of the country. Two of Capone's senior men were already in the room. One who counted money. One who solved refusals. The chair at the head of the table was occupied. The man in it had killed rivals and outlasted the year's worst attempts on his life. He had no need to prove he could hurt someone. He needed to decide if he could afford not to. The visitor sat down without asking for permission twice. He did not slouch. He did not bow. He did not act like a petitioner. He acted like an emissary. That posture was the first test, because in that room, posture was currency. Capone looked at him as if he were measuring a new weapon. Then Capone stood. He extended his hand. That motion was simple. It was also dangerous. A handshake that could not be spoken about later. A handshake that collapsed a rule everyone pretended was permanent. The visitor took it. He did not flinch. He did not perform gratitude. And the room took note. Al Capone, 29 years old, at the height of his power, over $100 million a year. That number meant something even among thieves. It meant he did not need Harlem, but he wanted Harlem's problem to stop reaching his desk, because another man was trying to take Harlem by force. Dutch Schultz. And Schultz was spending money in a way that drew attention. Monthly costs, bodyguards, bribes, funerals, a war that had no need ending. That war was not only killing men, it was shrinking profit. It was raising noise, and noise was what brought federal men with notebooks. The visitor spoke for Harlem. He spoke for a woman whose name carried weight where Capone's name did not. Stephanie St. Clair, Madame Queen. She did not come herself. She sent someone young enough to be disposable and smart enough not to be. The proposal was put on the table like a knife, not waved. Placed a division, a boundary, an agreement that said white bosses would stop taking and black operators would start paying. A tribute, a percentage, the price of peace and the price of being left alone. The numbers were stated, they were not whispered. Harlem's policy game, $20 million a year. A cut offered to Capone, 20%, $4 million, for doing almost nothing, for making a phone call, for telling other men to stop bleeding in a neighborhood. They did not understand. Capone did not smile like a friend. He smiled like a man who had just seen a better way to win. Because winning was not the same as owning. Owning required control. Control required soldiers. Soldiers required noise. And noise required heat. The visitor said the quiet part out loud. That fighting over Harlem would cost more than the victory. That cooperation was cheaper. That prophet did not care about etiquette. The room went still because he was speaking directly to Capone. Not around him, not through an intermediary. Direct. A black man addressing the most feared white gangster in America, as if this was a boardroom. In that silence, a decision was made. Not announced, but felt. Capone laughed. Not the laugh of relief, the laugh of recognition. Then Capone moved the deal. He changed the tribute, 15%, not as charity, as leverage. Because he wanted more than cash, he wanted the method. The machinery behind Harlem's numbers, the system, the discipline, the invisible math that made gambling stable, and he wanted a liaison. Not a messenger who would leave, a man who would stay in Chicago, a bridge that could not be photographed, a bridge that could not be confessed to, a bridge that would be denied by everyone who crossed it. That was the real offer. Not protection. Structure. A new arrangement that would operate under a public fiction. Segregation on the street. Integration in the ledger. If the deal held, Harlem would become protected territory. If the deal held, other bosses would stop pressing in. If the deal held, a young numbers man would return home with something stronger than a gun, a name behind his name, a silent backing that made threats hesitate. And if the deal held, it would not end in Harlem. It would travel, Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore, other black neighborhoods that were profitable and difficult to conquer. Other cities where white bosses wanted money without the cost. A national pattern, a secret understood by men who never wrote it down. A peace enforced without uniforms, a hierarchy enforced without speeches, and the consequence was simple. After that morning, certain doors did not open against him. Certain wars cooled down without anyone claiming credit. Certain men learned to stay out of a neighborhood. In 1928, America ran on rules that were not always written down. They were enforced anyway. Chicago was a white city with black labor. Harlem was a black neighborhood with white landlords. Both places had the same invisible border. You could cross it, but you paid for crossing it. In the South, segregation wore the uniform of law. In the North, it wore the uniform of custom. A black man could be refused a seat, refused a job, refused a handshake. Not because anyone needed a reason, because refusal was the reason. Police did not need to prove anything to enforce it. They only needed to decide. Restaurants decided, hotels decided, banks decided, unions decided. And when those decisions were challenged, the challenger usually stood alone. The decade was loud with contradiction. Harlem staged elegance. Music spilled from clubs. Writers and musicians filled rooms with talent and discipline. The neighborhood looked like a cultural capital. But the money that kept it alive did not come from theaters. It came from rent checks. It came from back rooms. It came from small bets stacked into large sums. It came from a game built for people who were barred from the official economy. Policy. The numbers. A lottery made out of daily life. A dime on hope. A dollar on luck. A three-digit number that could change a family's week. The winning number was tied to public figures to keep it out of human hands. A printed volume. A public count. A piece of legitimate machinery repurposed by the illegitimate. That design mattered. It meant the game could not be accused of cheating. It meant the operator could say the number was not his choice. It meant trust could exist where law did not. In Harlem, trust was a currency more stable than cash. Because cash could be taken, trust had to be earned, and the people who earned it became institutions. The operators built systems, runners, collectors, banks, protection. They paid bribes. They paid rent. They paid for silence. Thousands of people depended on it, not as a thrill, as income. A storefront could be a barbershop in daylight and a collection point by night. A restaurant could serve coffee and also serve as a quiet office where envelopes changed hands. That is how a neighborhood with limited access to legitimate credit created its own economy, an illegal economy, but organized, disciplined, efficient. And because it was efficient, it drew attention from men who believed efficiency belonged to them. In 1928, organized crime was not yet a single machine. It was a patchwork: Italian crews, Irish crews, Jewish crews, local outfits with local rules. Each group guarded its income like territory in a war, and prohibition made the stakes enormous. The government tried to erase alcohol from the country. The country kept drinking. Bootlegging filled the space between law and demand. That space was worth fortunes. $3 billion a year. It built empires. It bought police departments. It bought judges. It bought aldermen. It created men who lived like industrialists while pretending they were ordinary citizens. The underworld learned something during Prohibition. Violence was useful, but it was expensive. Bullets cost money. Funerals cost money. And every public shooting brought attention that did not leave federal attention. Newspapers, grand juries. A gangster could win a street war and lose the decade because power required longevity, and longevity required restraint. Some men understood this early. They looked beyond liquor. They watched the political mood shift. They heard ordinary people call prohibition a failure. They saw that repeal was not impossible. They saw that bootlegging might not last forever. So they began to plan for what would remain illegal. Gambling, narcotics, labor, the things that did not need an amendment to survive. In that planning, Harlem mattered, not as a symbol, as a model, because Harlem's numbers operation was older than many bootlegging networks. It was built for stability. It had redundancy. It had methods. It had managers who understood math better than most gunmen understood loyalty. White crime groups noticed the money. They also noticed the boundaries. Harlem was not a neighborhood you could simply walk into and collect, not without paying a cost. Black operators had something that white crews often lacked in black neighborhoods. They had cover. They had familiarity. They had a community that knew their faces. That same community might not love them, but it recognized them. And recognition could become protection. When outsiders arrived, outsiders were easy to spot. An unfamiliar car, a strange man on the corner, a new collector walking into a shop. Harlem watched itself because it had to. And when white gangsters tried to muscle in, they were not only challenging a racketeer, they were challenging a neighborhood's private economy. They were challenging the limited control black residents had over money moving through their streets. That created friction. Not moral friction, practical friction. Friction that turned disputes into war. The power structure was clear. White bosses owned the wider networks. They controlled import routes. They controlled political connections in downtown offices. They had access to lawyers and bankers who would not take meetings with black men. Black operators controlled what they could hold: their neighborhoods, their gamblers, their runners, their local protection. But they operated under constant pressure. Police raids could come at any time. Licenses could be denied. Loans could be refused. A case could be invented. A charge could be manufactured. And if a black operator became too visible, prisonability itself became a liability. That was the mechanism. Not always a formal decree, a system of denial, a system of selective enforcement. A system where the same behavior was treated differently depending on who did it. In that world, even crime had a caste. White criminals could move in public with a certain confidence. Black criminals had to move with calculation because the street was segregated and the underworld mirrored it. You could do business across that line, but you did not speak about it. You did not display it. You did not admit it, because admission would trigger punishments from both sides. White society would call it contamination. Black society would call it submission. So the line stayed in place, even when money wanted it gone. This was the background. This was the machinery. This was the pressure that made certain meetings possible and certain meetings unthinkable. And this was the world Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson lived in. He was 23, not a boss, not yet, a man who carried messages and consequences. A Harlem numbers man with a reputation that traveled ahead of him, but not far enough to make Chicago safe. He did not go to Chicago because he wanted a new city. He went because Harlem was under pressure. White crews were testing the numbers racket the same way they tested everything, by forcing their way in, by spending money on muscle, by making the game loud. And in Harlem, loud meant police. It meant headlines. It meant broken routines. Stephanie Stain, Claire, understood the math of survival. She understood that a street war was not only bodies. It was overhead. It was waste. And it was an invitation to outsiders who wanted the prize without the work. So she did something Harlem was not supposed to do. She sent an emissary to Al Capone, not to plead, to negotiate. That was the gamble. It was audacious enough to sound suicidal because it violated the assumption that mattered most in that world. White bosses controlled the map. Black bosses operated where they were permitted. The proposition refused that. It offered a different arrangement, a division of territory along the line America already pretended was permanent. Autonomy in black neighborhoods, tribute upward. No expansion into white space. No white wars in black space. A quiet agreement. A paid border. Bumpy Johnson arrived in Chicago 3 days before the meeting. He carried no gun. That was not virtue. That was tactics. A weapon would have been an excuse to end him before he spoke. He was searched at Union Station. Again at the hotel, his pockets emptied, his cuffs checked, his shoes inspected like they were contraband. He wore a suit that cost money, not flashy, expensive enough to signal that he was not a runner, simple enough to avoid looking like a challenge. His face did not advertise fear. It did not advertise anger. It held the calm of a man who understood the room could turn on him without warning. The Lexington Hotel was Capone's headquarters. Employees were on his payroll. Rooms could become hiding places or exit routes. Every stranger who entered was seen. Every conversation was weighed. Capone had increased security after attempts on his life. Bombs, bullets, messages delivered at close range. By late 1928, being powerful meant being hunted. So when Johnson walked into the lobby, the risk was obvious. A black man stepping into a white gangster's domain in an era when many establishments would not serve him at all. But he did not come uninvited. That was the point. Capone's people had granted him safe passage. They had told him he could leave alive, whether the answer was yes or no. That promise had weight only because Capone's name stood behind it. 2 Italian bodyguards escorted him through the hotel. Large men, silent men, men trained to look for movement that meant trouble. They watched his hands. They watched his eyes. They watched his breathing, not because they expected him to win, because they did not allow surprises. The private dining room was on the 4th floor. Mahogany, crystal chandeliers, a table loaded with Italian food and expensive wine. Hospitality used as theater. A reminder of wealth, a reminder of control. Capone sat at the head of the table, custom suit, the kind that cost more than most men earned in a year. He was not alone. Jake Guzik was there, the money man, the one who handled politicians and police. Frank Nitti was there, the enforcer, the one who handled the problems that could not be solved with talk. Johnson entered. He was seated. Capone stood, and he shook his hand. A gesture that would have shocked a room full of respectable men, because respectable men in 1928 often refused that touch. Capone did it anyway, not from progress, from calculation. Then he told Johnson to eat, because Capone did not like business done on an empty stomach. Johnson kept his posture measured, respectful, not submissive. He had to show Capone that Harlem could be spoken to, not simply taken. He began with deference to St. Clair, a formal respect. Then he placed the proposition in the room, a deal that offered peace, a deal that offered profit, a deal that demanded recognition without calling it equality. Capone listened, and he made sure Johnson understood what he was asking. A white gangster making a deal with a black gangster. That was not only a street issue. It was a social violation. It was a risk to reputation, a risk to alliances, a risk to the structure everyone pretended was fixed. Capone said the line that mattered. You want me to make a deal with a colored gangster. The words were not said softly. They were said as a test to see if Johnson would shrink, or if he would speak like a man who believed he belonged in the room. Johnson did not shrink. He met Capone's eyes. He offered the only argument that could survive in that space: profit. He said cooperation was more profitable than conflict. He said Harlem would cost more to take than it would ever return. He said Capone was the one boss bold enough to do what made business sense, even when it violated expectation. The silence that followed was not about manners. It was about power. Guzik stared. Nitti stared. They were not shocked by disrespect. They were shocked by directness. This was the moment Johnson could have disappeared, a young black man challenging a white boss inside a private room. But Capone did not move to violence. Capone laughed, a genuine laugh, a laugh that meant he had decided the kid was useful. He said he liked Johnson. He said Johnson had guts. Then he asked the real question. What does Harlem offer? And what does Capone get? Because Capone could always choose war. And war was a language he spoke fluently. Johnson brought out the document. A financial analysis, not a threat, a ledger. He laid out what Schultz and the others were spending. 50,000 per month, enforcers' bribes, violence, 6 months of war, bodies on both sides, and no real control gained. Then Johnson named Harlem's profit, the $20 million annually, after expenses, after bribes, after overhead. He offered a cut, 20%, $4 million, for peace, for protection, for Capone to use influence, to tell white bosses to stay out. Guzik checked the numbers. He said Johnson was right. $4 million a year was clean money. Money that did not require a war. Money that did not require new risk. Then Johnson said what mattered most. Sustain. Claire understood tribute. She was not challenging Capone's authority. She was not asking to be treated as an equal partner. She was asking for autonomy. Let Harlem be run by Harlem. Let black neighborhoods be run by black operators. Tribute would be paid. The line would be respected. Capone leaned back because the shape of it was clear. Income from territories he did not directly control. Influence without occupation. And a new kind of structure. But the implications were bigger than money. Capone said it plainly. Prison Johnson was asking him to change how the underworld operated. Johnson answered with one sentence. Yes, that is exactly what we are asking, and we are willing to pay for it. Capone stood and walked to the window. Michigan Avenue below. Cars moving like nothing in the world was changing. He stayed silent long enough to let the room feel the danger again. Then he turned back, and he accepted. Not as a favor, not as a concession, as a choice. But he did not accept the deal as it was offered. He said he accepted for reasons Johnson did not understand yet. He said the money made sense. Then he said the money was not the point. He said he had been thinking about the same structure for months, and Johnson's arrival told him something. That the smartest operators in Harlem had reached the same conclusion, independently. Capone treated that as proof. If two sides arrive at the same answer without speaking, the answer is usually correct. Johnson did not react, not on his face. But the shift was real. This was not Capone being convinced. This was Capone revealing that the meeting had been inevitable. Capone returned to the table. He leaned in, and he talked about the future. He talked about prohibition, like it was temporary, not a moral crusade, a policy that would eventually collapse under its own weight. He said the government would repeal it. Not immediately, but soon enough to matter. He said bootlegging would end. He said every organization that lived on liquor would have to find new income, and he named the rackets that would survive. Gambling, narcotics, labor, the enduring crimes. Then he said the line Johnson was not expecting to hear in that room. He said the colored neighborhoods ran the best numbers operations in the country. He said Harlem's policy game was more sophisticated than anything the Italians were doing. He said St. Clair's people had systems his people could learn from. And then Capone made the deal something else. He wanted technical cooperation. He wanted teaching. He wanted Harlem's methods. He wanted the machinery behind the cash. He did not ask politely. He demanded it as part of the agreement. Capone was not paying tribute to Harlem. Harlem would still pay tribute to him, but he was acknowledging expertise. And in that world, acknowledgement was leverage. Capone said yes to autonomy, but he wanted something that could outlast autonomy. He wanted the method that could be exported, so that when liquor died, gambling would already be industrial. Johnson listened, and the meaning became sharp. Capone was not simply protecting Harlem. He was preparing for a post-prohibition economy. He was using Harlem as an education, a blueprint. Then Capone added another piece. He said Johnson was not the first. He said he had been hearing similar requests from other black operators. Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore, not public meetings, quiet feelers. Messages passed through intermediaries. The same proposition. Autonomy for tribute. Capone said he had already been considering it, not as a series of small deals, as a national structure, a hierarchy, parallel tracks, white families and black operators running in defined lanes. The lane markers enforced by tribute and protection. Capone called it the smart play. Not because it was fair, because it was efficient, and efficiency was the only morality he respected. Then he made a counteroffer, 15%, not 20%. He lowered the tribute, not because he valued Harlem's comfort, because he wanted cooperation to feel like investment, not extortion. He wanted buy-in. He wanted compliance that came with pride, not resentment. Then he named the price. 3 of, say, Claire's best numbers operators would come to Chicago. 3 months. They would teach Capone's people how Harlem ran the game. Pickup systems, betting slips, payout structures, the discipline that made it scalable. And Johnson would stay in Chicago as Capone's liaison to Harlem. Not an errand man, a coordinator, a problem solver, a controlled conduit between two worlds that were never supposed to touch. Capone described it plainly. A national structure, everybody with a territory, everybody paying tribute, everybody respecting agreements, everybody making more money than they were making by killing each other. The room went silent again, because this was more than business. It was a reordering. It was a plan that required secrecy to survive. Johnson asked the only question that mattered. What happens when people find out? The Italian bosses, Harlem itself. What happens when the story becomes public? Capone smiled, and he said nobody finds out. He said the arrangement stays private. He said the Italian bosses would not be told the details, only the outcome. Wars in colored neighborhoods would stop, income would flow, boundaries would be respected, and in Harlem, Johnson would tell people the truth that could be spoken. That autonomy had been negotiated, that white bosses would back off, that tribute was the price of being left alone. Face would be saved on both sides, and the actual structure would remain inside a small circle, a secret protected not by loyalty, by mutual risk, because exposure would humiliate everyone involved. White bosses would be accused of treating black criminals as partners. Black bosses would be accused of working under white control. Neither side could tolerate that narrative, so the secret would be guarded. Not out of honor, out of necessity. Johnson said he needed to speak to St. Clair. Capone allowed it. He offered privacy. Then he tightened the chain. He said the offer was good for 1 week. After that, Capone would stop holding Schultz back. He would let the war resume, and whoever survived would own what was left. Capone said he could wait. He had time and money, but Harlem did not. That was the pressure point. That was how Capone negotiated. He framed the deal as mercy while holding the knife behind his back. Johnson understood what he was being offered. Not safety, a position, a role in a larger machine. If St. Clair agreed, Johnson would become more than a Harlem numbers man. He would become a broker, a liaison, a man protected by the logic of the structure itself. Because once a structure depends on you, removing you becomes expensive. And in that world, expensive was the closest thing to untouchable. The arrangement needed structure beyond Capone and Johnson's handshake. Over the following days, details were worked out. Territory was defined. Black gangsters received exclusive control over gambling, prostitution, and other rackets in predominantly black neighborhoods. White gangsters agreed not to compete in these areas. Boundaries were enforced. Tribute was formalized. 15% of gross profits from gambling and numbers operations went to Capone's organization. Payment was quarterly. Noncompliance meant loss of protection, and in that loss, white gangs could move in. Without obstruction, protection came in return. Capone's organization prevented attacks from other white gangsters. Police raids were minimized or coordinated. Backup was provided if disputes escalated. Knowledge sharing was implemented. Black numbers operators taught Italian gangsters. The systems developed in Harlem. Information about law enforcement, bribable officials, and expansion opportunities was exchanged. Dispute resolution mechanisms were established. Bumpy Johnson operated from Chicago. He coordinated between Capone's organization and black gangsters in multiple cities. He mediated conflicts before they turned violent. Secrecy was enforced. The public knew nothing. Most members of both organizations were unaware of the details. Only top leadership had full knowledge. Street-level criminals knew rules without knowing reasons. Enforcement relied on internal discipline. White gangsters who violated the agreement were punished by their own groups. Black operators who tried to avoid tribute faced the same. The arrangement stabilized operations without requiring open warfare. Johnson remained in Chicago for over a year. Safe houses were provided. Regular meetings with Capone and his advisors ensured coordination. Stephanie St. Clair sent 3 of her top numbers operators. They instructed Capone's people. In Harlem's sophisticated systems, quarterly tribute payments began in early 1929. Approximately $750,000 was delivered in cash. The money was laundered through banks, controlled by Capone and legitimate businesses. Violence decreased. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters retreated. Capone communicated boundaries through New York channels. Attempts to take Harlem would be seen as violations. Other black gangsters learned of the arrangement. They negotiated similar deals for their territories. A network of protected black gambling operations expanded across major cities. By mid-19, the arrangement was generating millions in tribute. Stability and autonomy were maintained. Cooperation across racial lines worked despite strict segregation in society. The Capone-Johnson arrangement produced consequences that neither man could have fully anticipated. The first consequence was structural. When Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky created the Commission in 1931, elements of the Capone Johnson model were adopted. Territorial exclusivity became formal. Each Italian family controlled its own area without interference. Conflict between families was reduced. Tribute and profit sharing arrangements were institutionalized. Dispute resolution mechanisms mirrored those Johnson had implemented. The informal model between black and white gangs became a template for organizing American crime nationally. The second consequence was stability for black organized crime. Prison protection allowed black gangsters to develop more sophisticated operations. Constant warfare with white gangs ended. Investments in operations increased. Numbers operations flourished. By the 1930s and 1940s, black controlled gambling in Harlem, Chicago's South Side, and Detroit generated tens of millions annually. Much of this revenue remained in black communities. Some operators accumulated wealth sufficient to fund legitimate businesses. The arrangement evolved into a mechanism supporting black economic development in areas limited by discrimination. The third consequence elevated Bumpy Johnson to power broker status. His role as liaison made him essential in maintaining the arrangement. He understood both black and Italian networks. Capone's backing, and later the commissions, made Johnson almost untouchable. He mediated disputes. He mentored younger black gangsters. He taught navigation of racial and criminal hierarchies. When he returned to Harlem in the 1930s, he ruled its underworld for decades. His authority was built on relationships forged in Chicago. The fourth consequence was the secrecy itself. Details of the arrangement remained hidden for decades. Neither Capone nor Johnson claimed public credit. The Commission incorporated territorial rules without disclosing their origins. Historians initially overlooked the cooperation between black and white gangs. Only later research uncovered the Capone Johnson system, revealing a deliberate chapter of organized crime history. Capone's imprisonment in 1931 did not dissolve the arrangement. Prison Frank Nitti maintained the Chicago operations. Johnson continued as liaison. The system endured through the 1930s and 1940s into the 1950s and 1960s, even as societal segregation eroded during the civil rights movement. Criminal racial boundaries persisted. By the 1970s, heroin replaced gambling, and black gangs became more independent. The arrangement finally ended, not through violence, but through obsolescence. Federal prosecutions weakened the Commission. Independent black criminal organizations no longer paid tribute. Drug trafficking shifted the economics of crime. By the early 21st century, the Capone Johnson system existed only in history books and in the memories of surviving participants. Its legacy demonstrated that pragmatic cooperation could cross the deepest social divides, even in a rigidly segregated America. The Capone Johnson arrangement revealed several lessons about organized crime and society. First, it demonstrated pragmatism across racial lines. Criminals cooperated where profit was at stake, even when society strictly enforced segregation. Cooperation did not imply equality. Black gangsters maintained autonomy, but white bosses held superior positions. Tribute payments institutionalized subordination while providing protection. Second, secrecy was central to the system. White gangsters avoided public scrutiny. Black gangsters avoided appearing subordinate. Mutual incentives preserved the fiction of independence. Third, conventional narratives about American organized crime were incomplete. Historians focused on Italian American families. They overlooked Black organized crime and its role in shaping networks. The Capone-Johnson deal remained hidden for decades. Only later research revealed its significance. Fourth, Capone's role was more complex than popularly imagined. He was not merely violent. He was strategic. He recognized that cooperation could generate greater profit than conflict. He treated Black gangsters as partners where it made business sense. His innovation created organizational structures that persisted long after his imprisonment. Fifth, Johnson's legacy highlighted strategy and diplomacy. He negotiated with one of America's most feared gangsters. He presented Harlem's proposition in a way that appealed to business logic. He became a bridge between racialized criminal networks. His authority derived from relationships rather than sheer violence. By the time he returned to Harlem, he controlled the underworld for decades. The Secret Alliance of 1928 had reorganized American organized crime. It demonstrated the power of negotiation, strategy, and pragmatic cooperation. It allowed wealth accumulation, stability, and influence in a society that otherwise limited Black opportunity. Capone and Johnson's meeting redefined the rules of the underworld. It showed that when money and power intersected, men could cooperate across the deepest social divides, and it created an arrangement whose effects would echo for generations. By the end of the 20th century, the Capone-Johnson arrangement had become history. Its structure, its secrecy, and its influence had faded from memory. The Commission weakened. Independent Black criminal organizations operated without tribute. Drug trafficking reshaped the economics of crime. Territorial boundaries mattered less. The carefully constructed system that once protected Harlem and other Black neighborhoods was obsolete. Yet its legacy remained in the patterns it had created. It showed that organized crime could be innovative. It showed that cooperation could cross rigid social divides. It showed that a single negotiation in a Chicago hotel could reshape a nation's criminal landscape for decades. Al Capone was remembered as a violent man, but his calculation, his foresight, and his willingness to recognize talent across color lines left a structure that outlasted him. Bumpy Johnson was remembered as a Harlem gangster, but his diplomacy, his strategy, and his role as liaison made him untouchable and allowed Black operators to gain protection, autonomy, and wealth. Their meeting in that Lexington hotel dining room was more than a negotiation. It was the origin of a secret alliance, a blueprint for a national criminal network that acknowledged race while exploiting efficiency, and it endured in silence for decades. History had long overlooked it. Only now can we trace the true impact of what happened that day. Cooperation, strategy, and secrecy had reshaped American organized crime, and it all began with a handshake, a ledger, and two men willing to imagine a different order of power.